Our final practitioner speaker is Zayne de Cruz, who's the Communications and Engagement Manager at the Melbourne Genomics Health Alliance, and I'll leave it to him to explain to you all about the growing field of genomics. Today he's going to talk to us about 6 ways that you can make a strengths-based storytelling approach an everyday practice. Thank you, Zayne.
Thank you all for having me today. A couple of things. First, just because I've got 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about 3 ways, not 6 ways. And secondly, I'm actually going to pick up right where Caroline left off and talk about how you actually can implement a strength-based approach to storytelling. So back in 2018, I was asked to lead the new storytelling team at Red Cross. And so our purpose was to collect really compelling human stories that could drive those multi-million-dollar fundraising campaigns. But now we had a mandate to do it in an ethical, strength-based way, which changed things very differently. And so there were 3 practices that we put into place at Red Cross that helped us turn around the way we tell stories. And those practices have actually carried into the medical research sector where I'm working now. And I want to just do a little bit of a defense of fundraisers here as well, because I feel like we sometimes do get a bad rap, and sometimes deservedly so. But fundraisers have it tough, right? So they have to raise millions of dollars in very, very short timeframes, and often with very little audience research to guide the creative choices they make, which then forces you to default to what is the traditional direct mail model of fundraising, which is really heavily driven by things like guilt, need and urgency. You're asked to evoke pity, and you're even asked to stimulate guilt, which is then eased by making a donation. So how do stories that emphasize strength and dignity and agency fit within that mold? And really, they can't. So you have to find a different way of connecting to your donors that is about shared pride rather than shared guilt, or about practical solutions, not unending need. One that's all about heroes, not victims and their saviors. And you need genuine insights about your audience before you can start. So that's the first tip for us, is one of the smartest things that Red Cross did was to hire a customer experience team. And that team spent a lot of time talking with donors one-to-one to understand their motivations, their values, and their experiences. And so prior to this, the fundraising team used to send out donors a survey every year. And the survey asked donors to pick on a list of things that Red Cross did, what they were most interested in hearing about. And you had disasters and emergencies, older Australians, homelessness, migrants and refugees, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Migrants and refugees was always ranked last, just before that by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And what fundraisers took that to mean was that our older, mostly white donor base only cared about older, mostly white people. And so every time my team pitched them a great story about a young Aboriginal person or about a recently arrived refugee family, they got turned down because they assumed donors didn't care. And you can imagine how personally hurtful that was for the Aboriginal storyteller on my team. So we had to ask the question a bit differently. This time we started asking people, are you interested in stories about families? Are you interested in stories about people who've overcome homelessness? Are you interested in stories about young people succeeding? And it turns out they were. And that meant that we could then segment our audience based on the kind of story they were interested in and pitch it to them. And so our 2019 tax campaign featured a young bachelor woman named Rose, and I'm just going to show you. So she's the one up the top there. So she had been homeless when she first started working with Red Cross and was now pursuing a national football career. That story broke even with the previous year. The following year, we told a story about helping people who were seeking asylum to make ends meet during the COVID pandemic. And it was told from the perspective of a caseworker who'd been a refugee himself. It broke every record that had ever been set in that campaign. That Christmas, we tested two different stories. The first story was an older Anglo-Australian woman who'd been supported by Red Cross through the pandemic. The second story was about a group of Aboriginal women who were in prison, who were supporting each other to raise their kids well and to make their lives better. Side by side, the story about Aboriginal women raised far more than the story about the older white Anglo woman. That was Red Cross's bread and butter. So what it showed us was that a strength-based story resonates, and resonates a lot more deeply than a story based on need, if you understand your audience and you align it with their values. So the second tip I have is about reforming the way that you collect and you store and you use your stories. So really, strength-based storytelling is about giving people the power over how their stories are told, how those stories are used, as Caroline just said, and for how long those stories are used. And so I want to share an example really from where I'm currently working, the Melbourne Genomics Health Alliance. So Diagnosis Day is a 6-part mini-series that we put together late last year. And the point of this series was to highlight the impact of a genetic diagnosis on a family and to help change the way that pediatricians and genetic counselors sometimes work with these families. So the series follows 6 Australian families, all of whom are living with a rare genetic condition, through the process of them living with the condition, seeking answers, getting a diagnosis, and working out what comes next. So we recruited these families through the Genetic Support Network of Victoria, and we knew going in that all of them had very personal, sometimes quite bruising stories to share. And so our aim going into this project was to make storytelling as positive and empowering an experience for the families as we could. So we designed everything based on the advice of consumer advocates who had lived experience, including what was right to engage with a family with a child who could potentially die in the next 12 months. We did extensive pre-shoot conversations with every family with several consent checks. We filmed people wherever they told us they were going to be most comfortable. Quite often that was in their home, sometimes it was in a playground. People had absolute power to tell their story in their own way. If they didn't want to answer a question, they knew they could decline it. If they wanted to take the conversation in a different way, they did. We discussed what aspects of their story and their family was most important, and we made sure we brought that out. And we asked people to reflect on what they had achieved and what made them proud. And that question, what made you proud, got us the strongest and most powerful content. And for a few of those families, no one had ever asked them that before. We showed people the scripts, we showed people the first cuts, and we invited them to change anything they didn't like. And that added a couple of months to the production process, but it was worth it. And then we got all of the families together for a special premiere screening so that they could meet each other and they could see their stories told together. So I'm lucky enough to work with a great evaluation team who are doing an evaluation of this project. And so this is what the family said about their experience and how they rated it. The series, Diagnosis Day, has had more than 79,000 views on LinkedIn and YouTube so far, which is really nice. And it's already being used to help train pediatricians and genetic counselors. So we'll release the full evaluation very soon, and there's a lot of really useful insights about what worked and what didn't work. But it's also shown me that when you make storytelling a rewarding experience for the people telling their stories, you get better stories as a result, especially when those people have been through times of crisis and vulnerability. And my last tip is really that once you're starting to work out how to do strength-based storytelling, you need to embed it. You need guidelines and you need champions. So at Red Cross, we created champions among the fundraising team. So every time my team went out on a shoot and we created a story, we would get all of our fundraising and marketing staff together and show it to them. Show them a video of the client speaking in their own words about what they'd been through, what they'd accomplished, what they were proud of, what it meant to them. And so what that did was it stopped people seeing the client as a few lines of copy and saw them as a real person and made you want to do justice to their story. And then you need guidelines. So here are some examples of brand and voice guidelines that I've been involved in at Red Cross and Melbourne Genomics. And I'd really recommend that what you do is you bring your comm staff and your program staff together and co-create those guidelines. Because what that means is you can talk openly about how you want to sound and how you don't. You can respectfully challenge each other. You can go back and forth on language, and you can land in a place that works for everybody. And then you can hold each other to account. And when you've got your guidelines, you circulate them widely, you use them to train new staff, and you use them to edit absolutely everything you put out. So those are quickly 3 practices that have helped me make strength-based storytelling a real thing. But it's really useful to think about it as ongoing learning. So you're learning from your customers. You're learning from people who have experienced vulnerability. You're learning from diverse storytellers who can tell their own stories much better than you ever can. You're challenging established ways of working, but also your own biases and your own assumptions. And ultimately, you're learning how to tell better and more authentic stories that will give your campaigns much more impact than the kind of needs-based cookie-cutter stuff that you can default to otherwise. Thanks so much for your time today. Love to have a chat with you all about your stories.